What if an entire civilization did not fall by war, invasion, or fire, but by sickness? What if the greatest collapse of the old world happened quietly, without a single date, without a final battle, and without monuments being destroyed? And what if the traces of that collapse are still visible today, hidden in plain sight? Before we begin, leave a comment answering this question. Do you believe history always tells the full truth, or only what survives? And if this kind of investigation interests you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts below, because this story only makes sense when questioned together. Between the years 1816 and 1850, while Tartaria was still appearing on maps, encyclopedias, and official references, something strange unfolded across the old world. There was no declaration of war against Tartaria, no recorded conquest, no single catastrophic event that marked its end. Instead, a slow and devastating force moved silently through cities, villages, and trade routes. Epidemic disease. This period is often described in fragments: cholera outbreaks, typhus waves, unexplained fevers, entire regions placed under quarantine. What is rarely emphasized is how widespread and synchronized these epidemics were, or how deeply they affected the social fabric of Tartarian territories and neighboring lands. Hospitals expanded at unprecedented speed. Temporary medical centers appeared in repurposed buildings, monasteries, schools, and large stone complexes whose original purposes were quietly forgotten. Quarantine zones divided cities into invisible borders. Travel documents became mandatory in places that once allowed free movement. Families disappeared from records not through violence, but through absence. Maps from this era still show Tartaria as a vast entity, yet census data becomes inconsistent. Population numbers fluctuate without clear explanation. In some regions, entire professional classes vanish from archives within a generation. Artisans, engineers, administrators, and scholars are suddenly no longer named. Buildings remain, but the people who once maintained their knowledge do not. Official history often treats these epidemics as isolated health crises, unavoidable tragedies of a pre-modern world. But the scale suggests something else. These diseases did not simply kill individuals. They dismantled systems. They disrupted inheritance, governance, education, and cultural continuity. When elders died without passing on knowledge, traditions ended silently. When entire households vanished, ownership shifted. When communities collapsed, administration was replaced. Here is where questions begin to surface. Why did medical responses during this period become so standardized across distant regions? Why did quarantine laws suddenly resemble one another from city to city, even where political authority differed? And why were some massive stone structures, later labeled as asylums or hospitals, already standing long before they were officially assigned those functions? Some researchers argue these buildings were repurposed in desperation. Others quietly wonder whether they were always intended for containment. No documents confirm this, yet the architectural similarities remain. During these decades, language itself begins to change. Old place names fade. Administrative terms are simplified. Complex systems of record-keeping are replaced with new standards. It is as if a reset occurred, not by decree, but by necessity. Survivors needed order, and order favors simplicity over memory. Tartaria's disappearance from maps does not coincide with destruction. It coincides with reclassification. Borders shift on paper long after populations have already thinned. What was once described as a cultural region becomes a historical footnote, not erased in one stroke but slowly absorbed into new narratives. Could a biological crisis succeed where armies failed? Could disease accomplish what conquest never did, leaving cities intact but societies hollowed out? And if so, who wrote the version of history that followed? By the mid-19th century, references to Tartaria grow vague, then symbolic, then obsolete. Yet the buildings remain, the roads remain, the unanswered questions remain. And as the world moves toward industrial modernity, few stop to ask what kind of civilization had to fade away for this new order to emerge so seamlessly. Because the most effective collapse is the one that leaves no clear ruins, only silence. As epidemics spread across the old world, fear became an organizing principle. Entire cities adjusted their rhythms not around commerce or tradition, but around containment. Bells once used to mark celebrations were repurposed to announce infection. Streets emptied, doors were sealed, Windows became the only boundary between life and uncertainty. What makes this period unusual is not merely the presence of disease, but the response to it. Authorities began enforcing measures that had never existed before at such scale. Mandatory isolation, forced relocation, the removal of children from households deemed unsafe. Records show entire neighborhoods disappearing from registries, not burned or destroyed, but reclassified as uninhabitable. In Tartarian regions, where social organization had long relied on extended family networks and localized governance, this was catastrophic. Epidemics did not just take lives, they broke continuity. When a generation vanished, so did its authority. When elders died, no one remained to challenge new rules imposed in the name of safety. Medical language from the era is revealing. Many reports avoid precise diagnoses. Symptoms are described broadly: weakness, fever, confusion, sudden decline. In some cases, patients were declared unfit, not only physically but socially. Once labeled, they were removed from public life entirely. This is where large institutional buildings enter the narrative more forcefully. Structures that today are labeled as 19th century hospitals or asylums often show architectural features that predate their supposed construction dates. Stonework, ventilation systems, water access, and scale suggest prior use. Yet official explanations insist these were emergency adaptations. Why were such massive facilities needed so quickly? And why do they appear almost simultaneously across vast distances? Transportation routes during this time also tell a story. While populations declined, infrastructure expanded. Roads were standardized. Railways began to cut through regions where local communities no longer resisted. With fewer people to object and fewer records to contradict, land could be reorganized efficiently. Some historians suggest this was simply modernization accelerated by tragedy. Others note something more unsettling, a coordinated transition that benefited from the vacuum left behind. Cultural memory suffered as much as population. Languages simplified, regional dialects faded. Complex symbolic traditions were replaced with uniform education systems. Children who survived epidemics often grew up disconnected from ancestral knowledge, raised instead under new institutional frameworks. And yet, there is a strange absence in the archives. Very few personal accounts survive from Tartarian voices themselves. The story of decline is told almost entirely by those who came after, by administrators, reformers, and medical authorities. The people who lived through it rarely speak in their own words. This absence invites speculation. Was Tartaria already weakened before the epidemics, or did the epidemics create the weakness? Were these diseases purely natural, or did environmental changes, industrial pollution, or experimental medical practices worsen their effects? Some contemporary critics of the time accused authorities of mismanagement, secrecy, and even exploitation of crisis. These accusations were dismissed, archived, and forgotten. By the 1830s and 1840s, the old world looked stable again on the surface. Trade resumed, cities repopulated, borders hardened. But beneath this stability was a new order built on loss. The old systems were gone, replaced by structures that assumed compliance rather than participation. Tartaria had not fallen in flames. It had faded through regulation, illness, and silence. And as new generations accepted this reality as normal, few questioned what kind of world had existed before fear became the foundation of governance. Because once fear becomes permanent, history becomes flexible. What replaced the age of epidemics was not a return to what existed before. It was something entirely different. As disease receded, new systems quietly solidified in its place. Systems that did not rely on memory, tradition, or local authority, but on classification, documentation, and centralized control. In the regions once associated with Tartaria, governance became increasingly abstract. Decisions were no longer made by those who lived within the community, but by distant offices relying on reports, numbers, and standardized forms. Identity shifted from being lived to being recorded. If something was not written down, it ceased to exist. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. During the decades following the epidemics, vast efforts were made to reorganize land ownership. Titles were reassigned, borders were clarified, entire territories were renamed or absorbed into new administrative units. The justification was order, the opportunity was silence. With fewer people to contest claims, restructuring became effortless. Education followed the same path. New schooling models appeared, teaching simplified histories and unified narratives. Children learned dates, not experiences, outcomes, not processes. Tartaria was mentioned less as a living civilization and more as a vague geographical expression of the past, something undefined, something irrelevant. Curiously, this educational shift coincided with the disappearance of older architectural terminology. Buildings that once had names tied to cultural functions were relabeled using generic institutional language. Palaces became administrative centers, complex halls became hospitals. Structures whose purpose was unclear were conveniently assigned new ones. No explanation was required. There were no witnesses left to object. Some researchers point to census gaps that persist for decades. Entire population groups appear to be missing from demographic recovery models. Migration does not fully explain it, nor does mortality alone. The numbers never quite reconcile. At the same time, new narratives of progress dominate public discourse. Industrialization is framed as salvation, central authority as necessity, uniformity as stability. The chaos of the past, often blamed on ignorance and poor hygiene, becomes the justification for sweeping change. But was the chaos truly accidental? Contemporary medical experiments were not unheard of during this period. New treatments, new chemicals, new theories about the human body and society. Some physicians openly argued that certain populations were more susceptible to disease, not biologically, but socially. That order itself could be imposed through medicine. These ideas were controversial. They were also quietly influential. Environmental factors also deserve scrutiny. Large-scale land modification, deforestation, canal projects, and early industrial pollution altered ecosystems rapidly. Water sources changed, air quality declined, living conditions shifted faster than populations could adapt. Disease may not have been the cause, but the consequence, yet official history rarely connects these dots. Instead, the narrative becomes linear. Epidemics happened, reforms followed, progress emerged. End of story. But history is rarely that clean. If Tartaria truly disappeared due to biological crisis alone, why was there such urgency to redefine its legacy? Why were its symbols stripped of meaning? Why does its name fade while its structures remain? Some suggest that what survived was inconvenient, evidence of a different organizational model, one that functioned without heavy centralization, one that valued continuity over efficiency. Once that model collapsed, intentionally or not, there was no incentive to preserve its memory. And so the old world moved forward. Standing on foundations it no longer recognized, the silence left behind was not accidental, it was useful. Because when people do not remember what came before, they rarely question what replaces it. And this brings us to the most unsettling part of the story, the moment when disappearance turns into normalization, and loss is mistaken for inevitability, a transition that still shapes how history is written today. By the mid-19th century, the transformation was complete enough to feel natural. What had once been emergency measures became permanent structures. What had once been temporary authority became institutional power. A generation born after the epidemics inherited a world already reorganized, and for them, there was nothing strange about it. Normalization is the final stage of any silent collapse. In official records, the period of mass illness was reframed as a lesson, a warning about the dangers of disorder. Texts emphasized cleanliness, obedience, and compliance as moral virtues. Health became inseparable from behavior. To be sick was no longer just to suffer physically, but to represent a social risk. This shift had profound consequences. Communities that once governed themselves through custom and consensus now relied on external permission. Travel required authorization. Work required registration. Existence required validation. People became legible to the system, and in return the system claimed to protect them. What was lost in this exchange was autonomy. In regions formerly associated with Tartaria, cultural expressions grew increasingly muted. Traditional clothing disappeared from public life. Oral histories stopped being passed down. Songs, symbols, and rituals survived only as curiosities, stripped of their original meaning and reframed as folklore. Even architecture was reinterpreted. Grand buildings that suggested advanced planning and coordination were explained away as products of forgotten benefactors or misunderstood engineering. The possibility that they belonged to a coherent civilization was rarely entertained. Why ask difficult questions when simpler explanations suffice? Some anomalies, however, refused to disappear. Construction techniques that modern historians struggled to replicate. Urban layouts that aligned with environmental principles later rediscovered. Infrastructure that seemed excessive for the populations officially recorded at the time. These inconsistencies were noted, then ignored. Meanwhile, the narrative of inevitability took hold. The idea that Tartaria was always destined to fade, that its disappearance was natural, that progress required sacrifice, even if no one could clearly name what had been sacrificed. This narrative was powerful because it absolved responsibility. If no one caused the collapse, then no one needed to answer for it. Yet fragments of doubt persisted. Letters questioning census figures, reports criticizing medical overreach, observations about forced relocations framed as humanitarian necessity. These documents exist, but they sit quietly in archives, rarely cited, rarely discussed. And when they are discussed, they are dismissed as paranoia, exaggeration, or coincidence. But coincidence loses credibility when patterns repeat. A civilization fades during a prolonged health crisis. Its population declines unevenly. Its cultural markers vanish. Its land is reorganized. Its name disappears. Its structures remain. Its memory becomes inconvenient. At what point does chance become design? This is where speculation enters, not as fantasy but as a response to absence. When official explanations leave gaps, the human mind seeks coherence. Some call this conspiracy. Others call it critical thinking. The truth may not be dramatic. It may not involve secret meetings or hidden masters. It may simply involve opportunism. A crisis exploited rather than created. A collapse guided rather than resisted. History does not need villains to be rewritten. It only needs silence and time. And by the time questions resurface, the world has already moved on. What remains is a landscape filled with inherited assumptions, and a past that feels distant not because it was ancient, but because it was intentionally simplified. Which leads us to the final question. Not what happened to Tartaria, but why its story still unsettles us today, and why its disappearance continues to echo in the way modern society responds to crisis, authority, and fear. The story of Tartaria unsettles not because it is fully understood, but because it feels familiar. The mechanisms that accompanied its disappearance are not confined to the past. They echo in modern responses to crisis, in the language of safety, and in the quiet trade between freedom and protection. When disease reshaped the old world in the early 19th century, it did more than alter demographics. It established a precedent. Emergencies justified permanent change. Temporary measures became lasting frameworks. Authority expanded in the name of survival, and few questioned it because fear had already done the work. This is the enduring legacy of Tartaria's illness. What vanished was not only a civilization, but a way of organizing life that depended on memory, locality, and continuity. What replaced it was a system optimized for scale, efficiency, and control. One that thrives on documentation rather than lived experience. One that remembers through records instead of stories. The absence of a single moment of collapse is precisely what makes the event so difficult to confront. There was no day of defeat, no visible ruin. The transition happened while buildings remained standing and life appeared to continue. And perhaps that is why Tartaria is so often dismissed. It challenges the comforting belief that history changes only through obvious violence. It suggests that entire worlds can disappear through administration, reform, and good intentions. That a population does not need to be conquered to be transformed beyond recognition. The epidemics between 1816 and 1850 were real. The suffering was real. But suffering alone does not explain the erasure of identity. Nor does it explain the urgency with which the past was redefined once the crisis passed. Some will argue that this interpretation assigns meaning where there is none, that the gaps in history are simply the result of poor record-keeping, that modern society emerged naturally from tragedy. Others will ask harder questions. Why do the same architectural remnants exist across regions that supposedly had no shared culture? Why were pre-existing structures so easily absorbed into new institutional roles? Why does the narrative of Tartaria feel intentionally vague, even today? These questions do not require dramatic answers to be valid. They require curiosity. They require a willingness to accept that history is not just what happened, but what was preserved, what was edited, and what was allowed to fade. The fall of Tartaria, if it can be called a fall, was not marked by fire or conquest. It was marked by silence, compliance, and normalization. A civilization did not collapse outwardly. It dissolved inwardly, and once dissolved, it became easy to forget. What remains is not proof but pattern, not certainty but resonance, a reminder that the greatest transformations often occur without spectacle, and that the most effective erasures leave structures intact while removing meaning. If Tartaria truly fell sick, then its illness was not only biological, it was systemic, and the cure reshaped the world. The question is not whether Tartaria existed exactly as imagined. The question is why the idea of its disappearance still provokes discomfort, debate, and resistance. Because deep down, many sense that this story is not only about the past, it is about how societies respond when fear becomes permanent, when crisis becomes opportunity, and when silence becomes history. And perhaps that is why the traces of Tartaria refuse to disappear, standing quietly around us, asking not to be believed, but to be questioned.